Persona 5 Tactica is the latest entry in the Persona series, and is the fourth spin-off featuring the Persona 5 cast. The game was recently released worldwide, and I know a lot of people are on the fence about this one due to the dramatically different art style and gameplay. I myself was pretty unsure about Persona 5 Tactica going into it. However, I came out pleasantly surprised with what's on offer here. While I usually make videos going into detail about my experiences surrounding these games, I figured that today I'm gonna do something a little bit different and see if the game is right for you. Is Persona 5 Tactica something you should bother trying out, or is it something you're better off skipping out on? I'll be doing this with as little spoilers as possible, and will only be showing footage from the first two areas of the game. Don't worry, I'm still gonna make a full breakdown on this game in the future, but since Tactica is still new, I just wanted to strike while the iron is hot, you know? However, before we get started, I wanted to disclose that I was provided with a review copy of this game by Sega and Atlus. To a lot of people, this will immediately put whatever I say, both positive and negative, under scrutiny, and I don't blame people for thinking that way. The most I can do is assure people that my words cannot and have never been influenced by the prospect of getting review codes. I'm pretty sure my previous track record is more than enough proof of this. However, regardless of those previous reviews, it's impossible to deny that we all have our own personal biases. Sometimes people will like something that others won't, so do yourself a favor and don't just take my word for it. And look at other reviews too to see if this is something that you'll like. Games are pretty expensive nowadays, and the last thing we want is to drop a bunch of cash on something we end up hating. Or in Tactica's case, a bunch of cash plus a tip if you want to get everything on offer. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. The first thing that we should get out of the way is that Persona 5 Tactica, while undoubtedly its own thing, shares a lot of similarities with previous Persona spin-offs, mainly the Persona Q games. Now this could either be a good or a bad thing depending on your opinions of those titles. In fact, this is something that I noticed the second when starting Tactica, since the premise is the exact same as those games. Persona 5 Tactica opens up with the Phantom Thieves hanging out in LeBlanc, when they're suddenly whisked away into a completely different world, not unlike the metaverse. When they arrive, the Phantom Thieves discover a tyrannical force known as the Legionnaires have a tight grip on the land, with their leader being the sadistic Queen Marie. While the Phantom Thieves are forced to stand their ground then and there, Marie's army proves themselves to be too much for the rebels, and they end up being completely overwhelmed. Most of the party is even brainwashed into joining Marie's group, with Joker and Morgana being the sole members remaining. However, just when all hope seems lost, a mysterious figure rushes in and buys the remaining Phantom Thieves enough time to make a quick escape. This is Irina, this game's poster mascot character and leader of the Rebel Corps. She's the one in charge of taking the fight to Marie. However, lately, they've been on the back foot. Since Joker and Morgana are unable to take on Marie by themselves, they agree to assist the Rebel Corps, under the agreement that they'll help rescue their friends. Surprisingly, this is something that gets done in a relatively swift manner. Most of the opening missions are spent trying to break the other party members free from Marie's mind control. However, during one of the scouting missions, we're introduced to our third major player. This is Toshiro, a politician that recently vanished out of nowhere, and because this is a Persona spin-off game, he just so happens to have amnesia. From here on, the story falls into a simple pattern. If the Phantom Thieves want to find their way home, then they need to travel through the many different time periods and beat up the bad guys along the way. And with each area liberated, Toshiro regains a fragment of his memory. If that at all sounds familiar, that's because this is the exact same setup and formula as the Persona Q games. Since I want to keep this a relatively spoiler-free video, I'm not going to go into any specifics. What I will say is that this is one of the most Persona spin-off plots I've ever experienced. If you have any knowledge of how these things play out, you can probably predict what happens in this game's story based on context clues. Hell, even if you haven't played any of these spin-off games before, it's not like this is some masterpiece in storytelling or anything. The game isn't exactly subtle with its foreshadowing. But we can't have a narrative without characters, so how well do they stack up? This was my biggest fear in regards to Tactica's story, if I'm being honest. And let me just tell you that the obvious Persona Q influence was an instant red flag to me. The Persona Q games are rather infamous for their simplistic characterizations of the main cast. Characters are boiled down to one-note traits, which greatly put off the crowd that was heavily invested in their stories. They're games that prioritize fan service above all else, and while that's fine for some people, it's not something that I'm a huge fan of. So, does Persona 5 Tactica manage to sidestep this issue? Well, not really. I will admit that the characters here are a bit more rounded than something like Persona Q2, for example, but it's not on the same level as something like Persona 5 Strikers to me. Ultimately, we're still getting more simplified versions of the Phantom Thieves, but with some implied history. Every once in a while, they'll mention something that happened in the main game that makes you go, yeah, I remember that. But in most honestly serves as a cute reference more than anything. There's this really annoying trope in these games where the writers constantly go out of their way to make the original characters relate to the struggles of the new ones. It's not even a subtle way either, since whenever some information about Toshiro is revealed to the audience, the characters have to stop and say, "Wow, that's just like what happened to me." Once you notice this is something that they do, you can't unsee it. As far as the character writing goes, it's a definite improvement over the Q games, but don't expect the characters to learn or grow as a result of this journey. It leans more into the fan service territory, like I said. Funnily enough, this game features strolls ripped almost wholesale from the Persona Q games as well. In between story chapters, you can do a quick aside and talk to your party members to get a better feel of the situation, or to just make casual conversation. And just like in Persona Q, these are pretty hit or miss for me. Sometimes these talk events would lead to a fun character moment or two, and other times it would exist to reiterate information that we already know, or worst of all, just have characters speculate about upcoming events in the plot. Reflection is always nice, but not when it ends up being needless fluff dialogue. I swear, sometimes an event would happen in the story, then immediately after, I'd unlock a talk event where characters would go, "Whoa, wasn't that crazy or what?" And it would end before I even knew it. I honestly wouldn't blame anyone for fast forwarding through these lines after a while, since it's sort of up in the air as to whether or not these conversations will be a waste of time going into them. Despite the issues I mentioned, I can't quite say I dislike the game's narrative on the whole. This is because for as many familiar traps the writers fall into, it's made up for by the new characters. I'll just say this right now. Your enjoyment of this game's narrative hinges on whether or not you like Toshiro as a character. While it's true that Arena is the main focus of the advertisements and does get some development throughout the story, the real star of the show is Toshiro. Persona 5 Tactica? More like Persona 5 Toshiro, because this guy is borderline the main character. Sure, this does make him one of the more fleshed out characters in the ever-evolving Persona spin-off cast, but this comes at the cost of putting all of their eggs in one basket. If you don't like Toshiro and don't give a shit about what's going on with him, then you're not gonna like this story. Simple as that. Thankfully, I find this character to be pretty interesting, and dare I say, engaging later on. I don't want to reveal the twist too much, but he really started to grow on me by the Third Kingdom. On the whole, the story is fine. Nothing that I would call particularly special, but it also isn't offensively bad. Some good moments are buried in here, but the flip-flopping quality keeps it from coming anywhere close to some of my favorites in the series. It's about what I expected, to be honest. However, something that I was really looking forward to since day one was the gameplay. Ever since that initial reveal, I knew that this game was going to be right up my alley, and after getting a chance to finally play it, oh yeah, it definitely lived up. As the name would imply, Persona 5 Tactica isn't so much a traditional RPG, rather it's a turn-based tactics game. Think of something like XCOM or fucking Mario and Rabbids, but with a Persona spin to keep the idea fresh. You build a team of 3 party members of your choosing, and the name of the game here is to take down every enemy while suffering from as little casualties as possible. Party members are defined by a few different traits, the main ones being their movement range and damage type. While everyone has access to guns and melee weapons, elemental damage works entirely different in this game. Instead of having your standard fire, ice, and electric damage types are instead defined by their secondary attributes, and whether or not they inflict splash damage. Garu, for example, is a single target spell with short range, but it comes with the added benefit of flinging the enemy to another location. Every spell has its own effect, and while some are a bit similar to others, they're distinct enough to give them a unique edge. Personas are going to be your go-to way to remove enemies from cover, but they aren't the end-all be-all solution since the SP cost of spells are extremely high in this game. Persona 5 Tactica encourages smart positioning above all else. Leaving any of your party members out in the open is basically a death sentence in most scenarios. On higher difficulties, enemies won't hesitate to dogpile someone when given the chance to, so you better make sure that they're either behind cover or completely out of harm's way by the end of their turn. However, this is a two-way street, since if you manage to catch an enemy off guard with an attack, you'll be granted with a 1-more. 1-mores in this game are disgustingly overpowered in the hands of the right player. Not only do they give you a chance to act for a second time, but 1-mores also reset the movement of your character. This means that with proper planning and good skill usage, you'll be able to move a character from one side of the map to another, which goes hand in hand with another staple mechanic, the triple threat. Triple threats are pretty much the same as all-out attacks, but they require some thinking to get the most out of them. Whenever you knock down an enemy, a transparent triangle will appear on the battlefield, with its lines connecting to your party members. If you're able to position the downed enemy within the danger zone, you'll be able to form a triple threat and deal massive damage. Simple, right? But the thing is, if other enemies happen to get caught in the blast zone, then they'll be damaged as well. Triple threat can be outright disgusting in the hands of the right player, since it technically has unlimited range. This is such such a satisfying mechanic to play around with. It's got a very easy to understand rule, but mastery of the mechanic requires the player to take full advantage of their environment. You need to have a willingness to take some risks, as to get the most use out of it, your party needs to be spread out. There's an ongoing tug of war between risk and reward whenever the opportunity for a triple threat presents itself. And what's great is that it's not some end-all be-all victory condition. If you don't deal enough damage and leave your party members in a bad spot, the tides can easily shift and you'll be punished for your carelessness. The core mechanics of Persona 5 Tactica are extremely easy to understand, but they offer plenty of nuance thanks to the amount of party customization on offer here. I already mentioned that every party member serves a different purpose in battle thanks to their elemental specialty, but every character can also be further tweaked through sub-personas and their specialized skill trees. Sub-personas are the exact same as they were in Persona Q. They allow you to equip secondary skills and passives to a party member that they usually wouldn't have. The difference is that this time, there's a lot more limitations with this system. Sub-personas only have 2 skill slots. There's a unique skill tied to that persona, and the skill that'll be inherited through fusion. When fusing a sub-persona for a character, it's best to have a certain party member in mind that you know will take full advantage of their abilities. A trap I fell into early on was fusing sub-personas with a lot of elemental diversities instead of putting an emphasis on passive skills. Sure, having damage type coverage can be good in some scenarios, but passive skills are a much better option for the most part. You can make some pretty good personas with proper planning, but the one inheritable skill limit is going to be a bit tricky to work with. Pro tip, if you combine 2 sub-personas of the same type, you'll get a stronger version of that persona. It took me nearly the whole game to figure that out, so I mostly just relied on fusion search instead. The other, and arguably more interesting form of character customization are the skill trees. As you play the game, every character earns GP, which you then spend on this skill tree to unlock some bonuses for your party members. This could be as simple as upgrading their current skills, buffing their passive abilities, or just little things like increasing the range of their persona attacks. What's really cool is that you can assign skill points, then respec them anytime you want. This means that when you're given a preview of the map layout, you can decide what loadout works best for you. Got a map with a lot of elevation? Maybe I should spec into upgrading my follow-up attacks. A map with a lot of empty space? Upgrade your charge skills and take full advantage of passing turns. There's a lot that can be done with the skill tree, and while it's true that most of these are flat upgrades rather than anything too game-changing, there is some thought that needs to go in how you upgrade your characters. As someone who has done all of the content in the game, there isn't enough GP to completely max out the skill tree, so it's up to the player to decide where the best places to invest are. A small complaint I have about this system is that there aren't any presets you can save. It can get a little tedious respecking your characters whenever you want to change your strategy, doubly so if you're only doing it for a single mission. Having like 3 slots to save presets would have been appreciated so we can toggle back and forth without any hassles. There are a few other complaints I have with Tactica's gameplay, but I think that it's beyond the scope of a shorter video like this. Whenever I get around to making a full breakdown on this game, there's a lot more that I would like to talk about. Hell, there's even some comparisons that could and should be made to some of Atlus's other tactical RPGs they put out. But for now, I just sort of wanted to give a rundown on this one to see if it was right for you. $60 might seem a bit steep for some people, but you're getting a good chunk of content to experience. The main campaign took me nearly 30 hours to complete, and that includes doing all the game's optional missions, spending a decent amount of time in the Velvet Room, and getting 3 stars on almost every mission. I also played this game on the hardest difficulty too, if that means much. To me, that seems like a fair price. At no point did I feel as though the game was overstaying its welcome from a gameplay sense. I was left wanting more in a good way, and while I was hoping that the DLC would satisfy those cravings, it unfortunately didn't do much for me. Persona 5 Tactica's Repaint Your Heart DLC isn't bad, but you should absolutely know what you're getting into before buying it. It might be tempting to pick this one up for the sole purpose of playing around with Akechi and Kasumi, but the campaign itself plays vastly differently from the main game, both in terms of character progression and even core mechanics. The main gimmick with Repaint Your Heart is the paint mechanic. As you attack enemies or target certain objects, you paint the town over with your own color. The same is true for the enemies. This turf war sort of plays a massive role in how you traverse the map, since you can only use skills while standing on your own paint or in any unpainted zones. This mechanic forces you to completely rethink the way you approach battles, and while this can be seen as refreshing to some people, I can't quite say I'm the biggest fan of it. I already thought the mechanics in the main game functioned just fine enough, so this whole whole paint shit was pretty unnecessary for me. While I did finish the DLC, I thought it was just fine overall. Sorry if that's a bit vague. It's just that there isn't too much I can talk about without going too deep into spoiler territory. Seems like something that's better off saved for a full video. As for whether or not you should pick up the DLC, I don't know, probably not, unless you're fully on board with the paint mechanic. You're at least getting a nice chunk of content. For $20, it comes with a 5-hour campaign, some bonus maps, and 2 new playable characters. I can see why this wasn't included in the main game because of how differently it plays, but I still think that this should have been an unlockable extra for beating the game. It just doesn't feel right for me to have this full-price game launch with a sizable amount of content locked behind day 1 DLC, but I guess that's just the world we live in now, huh? So yeah, I ended up enjoying Persona 5 Tactica way more than I thought I would. The gameplay is solid and offers plenty of room for creative play. The customization adds an extra layer of personalization to the experience, the map design is solid, and there's a decent amount of content on offer. Gameplay-wise, Tactica is solid, and low-key, it might be my favorite Persona spin-off from that perspective. But what's holding it back from becoming my favorite spin-off is the narrative. It's safe, boring, and predictable. I think the characterization is an improvement, but it only helps so much when what's being served here is more of the same. Sure, there are some good moments in the story, but it only makes up for so much in my eyes. Do I recommend Persona 5 Tactica? I'd say yeah, but only for those who know what they're getting into. Don't go into this game expecting a story as deep as something like Persona 5 Strikers or anything, and understand that tactics games are a bit of a niche genre. But if you're willing to give this game a fair shake, then I think you'll have a good time. I just hope that Atlus doesn't give up on this genre after the first attempt. This type of game has a lot of potential, and if it ever gets a sequel, then I can imagine this solid foundation getting built up into something truly incredible.